Hello and welcome to the San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books. My name is Jonathan Hunt. I'm the coordinator of Library Media Services at the San Diego County Office of Education. I have a deep and abiding passion for children's literature, and I've had the great good fortune to write about it, speak about it, teach about it, review children's books, serve on award committees, and moderate wonderful panels like the one that I'm currently doing right now. We have a pair of wonderful authors here to talk about their books with us today. We have Megan Freeman, who lives near Boulder, Colorado. She has been an award-winning teacher. She has written for all age groups, children, young adults, and adults. She's an accomplished poet, and she's here to talk about her debut middle grade novel, Alone. Also on the panel, we have Chris Barron. Chris Barron is from San Diego, where he teaches at San Diego City College. He's a professor of English there. He also has written for a variety of age groups. His first book was All of Me. It came out to a lot of accolades. And then his second book was just recently published, The Magical Imperfect. And again, another accomplished award-winning poet. I probably should explicitly mention that both of these are verse novels. They're written in verse. So we're very happy to have both of them here to talk to us about their books. So I'm going to start off with a question that I would just ask each of you to tell us about the journey to publication with your latest, most recent book. So what were some of the things that surprised you, or some of the challenges that you had to overcome, or some of the rewarding things that happened along the way? So why don't we go ahead and start with you, Megan?
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. My journey to publication with Alone was quite long. I started writing the book in about 2010. And when I started writing, I immediately started writing in prose. And I didn't even consider writing in verse. I'd been a poet for most of my life. I started writing poetry in elementary school and have continued my whole life and thought of that as a completely separate thing. And when I sat down to write the book, I started writing in prose. And the book is a contemporary retelling of Island of the Blue Dolphins. So it follows the story of a girl who is left behind in her Colorado town when everyone else leaves. The town is abandoned and evacuated, and she's accidentally left behind and has to survive on her own. And I wrote the whole thing, and I tried to get an agent, and I got a lot of interest from agents. I think the first 50 pages or so were really well written, and it was a compelling hook, but nobody really wanted to take it on, and it didn't convert to anything. And then I was sitting in a workshop with another author, with Melanie Crowder, who is the author of many books, but most specifically Audacity had just recently come out, and which is a beautiful YA novel in verse. And she was talking about her process for writing in verse. And it had been about 4 years since I'd been working on Alone. And all of a sudden it hit me like a ton of bricks. This wants to be rewritten, and it wants to be written in verse. And so I went back to the drawing board and I started all over, and I rewrote the whole thing in verse. And it really transformed the story. It transformed the character. It allowed me to go into her intimate experience in ways that the narrative prose didn't. And when I went back out and queried it to agents, I got a lot of interest right away. And then Simon & Schuster picked it up after about 3 months out on submission. So it was a 10-year process from beginning to publication. But a lot of that was me struggling to find the form that it wanted to be told in.
Excellent. You know, you mentioned Island of the Blue Dolphins, and I didn't initially make that connection. I haven't read, this is probably heresy, I've not read Island of the Blue Dolphins, even though Scott Odell did write that book, living in Julian, California, which is just, right, up the road. So I was a little bit shocked when I read the review afterwards that said that it was based on Island of the Blue Dolphins. Mm-hmm. Another comparison that I got in the reviews a lot was Hatchet, which I could definitely see Hatchet with the wilderness survival adventure. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you so much. Megan, I love hearing your story. It's interesting. It reminds me, so with All of Me, it was a very similar story. It started much earlier and a distillation of so many experiences and ideas. But for this book, it was really, really different in the sense that I worked really closely with my agent to develop the story. And then this idea of like what was going on in the world at the time of so many polarizing factors, I started to imagine like this small town of people who were different, different cultures, ethnicities, who had come together. And I started just imagining and writing about that and writing a lot of different poems about that. And working with my agent, we kind of crafted it into a story. And this particular book has so many layers of story. I think it's remarkable that it came together the way it did. But I was able to work on it really closely, distill the poems, get them, and find the plot, characters, setting, point of view, theme that existed there. And then I was able to share it with my editor, Liz Obla at Bywell and Friends Macmillan, and had the great joy of working with her again on this book. So it was a very different, much shorter process in the sense that this book had not been building for years and years and years, even though the themes really had.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I would also say that I read the book list review of your book that came out. I just happened to be reading book list and I saw the starred review and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the book that we're talking about on the panel. And they also made some really nice positive comparisons to Wonder as well as Hello Universe. That's a recent Newbery Medal winning book. So I thought that was a really nice comparison as well. I would be remiss if I didn't kind of like take a step back and maybe do a little bit of synopsis for what each book is about, because I realized we just kind of dived into talking about them. And I also, if you wouldn't mind, if you would indulge me, I have a short poem from each of the books just to read aloud to give people kind of a flavor for the story and what's going on. So Alone is the story of a young girl who plans this overnight camping trip, like a sleepover with her friends, and it doesn't work out, and she's out there alone, and then everybody disappears on her. For 3 years, she's alone and she's kind of surviving on her own, and she's got the dog, the neighbor's dog, the Rottweiler, and so it's very much a wilderness survival adventure. And so I have picked a poem from the middle of the book that is called Days, Weeks, Months. Weeds choke the yards in all the neighborhoods, and grass grows tall and goes to seed. Dogs and cats roam the streets, foraging for food. The summer crawls by, and the evenings begin to cool off. I talk to the silence. Sometimes I sing. I study my features in the mirror, looking for traces of my family. I don't recognize my face, but I see my father in my hands. The Magical Imperfect is a historical novel. It's set in 1989 in the San Francisco Bay Area during the time of the Loma Prieta earthquake. And this is a wonderful friendship story between a boy who is Jewish and who is electively mute. He talks very, very sparingly. And a friendship that he develops with a Filipina girl who has eczema. So she's got the skin condition and people call her the creature at school. And they form a wonderful friendship. So I could definitely see the comparisons like the Hello Universe and Wonder. I felt like both of those were really apt comparisons. And the brief poem that I chose from this one is called Shyness. Shyness is the swirly part of a glass marble. All those colors, a tiny universe trapped inside the smallest space. I've never tried to crack a marble, but if I did, I bet the inside would explode into stars. So that's a little bit of a taste for our audience of, kind of like a plot synopsis as well as a taste of some of the poetry that you'll find inside. My next question was going to be a convoluted two-part question, and you're free to answer both of them or just one of them. But in fact, Megan, I think you already answered one of them. I was going to talk about what attracted you to telling this particular story in verse or in poetry? And I believe that you already addressed that. And then the second one was, given that you've both written for a range of readers, what is it about a middle grade audience that really attracts you? Or what are some of the special considerations that you might need to take into account when you're writing for that kind of an audience? So it's a two-part question. It's kind of one part of the question is about form, why poetry, and one part is about audience. Why is this a story that begs to be read by middle grade readers in particular? Mm-hmm. I picked on you first last time, Megan. So I'll put Chris on the hot spot this time around.
I really want to hear Megan's answer though. Because I think it's such an interesting question about why verse. And for me, poetry is like a native language. I feel like I love the rhythm and the musicality of poetry, and the way that it lends itself to like the internal landscape of characters. Mm-hmm. And this, in a convoluted way, also meshes with your second part of your question, which is I think that a lot of middle grade readers are often very internal. In other words, like, have you ever asked a middle grade kid how they're doing or how their day was? Their answer is typically like, good, fine, but they have so much going on inside. And I think poetry represents that internal kind of flood of emotion, ideas, happenings, action, and everything else. So for me, particularly in this book, there was, like I said, so many layers of plot, so many actions happening, from the earthquake to the World Series, to the ancient magic, to the friendships, to the intergenerational relationships. It's like trying to put it all together. I just wrote poems that were finite blocks, kind of like the one you read in Shyness, and then was able to distill the concepts and then kind of layer them one on top of another. So it really lent itself to constructing a plot, because I know that my structure and my style is very narrative. I like narrative poetry, even though I use syllabic form quite a bit to keep the rhythm that I want to use. But I feel like poetry allows for, the white space on the page, the breaths, the internal and the external, the action to flow, but the pauses to happen. So all of that lends itself to what I think is, for these characters, Eitan and Malia, they're very, shy, quiet, soft approach to the world. And I think poetry lends itself to that. And also there's a lot of imagery of the setting. I really wanted people to, feel what it was like to walk through a forest and to hear the rocks drop into the pool where they're sitting, And I think, again, imagery and figurative language can bring these big abstract concepts down to earth. For middle grade in particular, I think this genre, this middle grade work that people do is incredible because it deals with very difficult topics, which kids are going through. And it brings it forward in a way that, they enjoy because it's full of action. But but often, and still, I know with my kids, they're read alouds. Families can come together around a story that evokes thought and emotion and ideas that's just enjoyable, but also presents itself in a way that maybe is scary in a fun way, but isn't like horrific. You know what I mean? Like there's some protections put on it in a sense, because I know that I was so absolutely changed by stories that I read at this age. And this is when the world was affecting me and I was forming myself. So as a middle grade writer, I just feel really privileged to take part in that. And I really try to think of it as a very sacred time when I'm writing. So anyway.
That's so interesting. So much of what you just said, Chris, resonates with my experience as well, including the poetry being a language. And one of the experiences that I had when I started revising from the original prose draft into the verse form was that I just felt so much more fluent. And I realized I was more fluent in poetry than I was in narrative prose at that time. And I could immediately feel the difference in my experience writing it. And I knew that the text was better and stronger for it. The other piece that I think is similar to what you're talking about is that the character of Maddie is really the only character in the book for 95% of the story. And her only companion is a Rottweiler who doesn't speak back to her, although she definitely converses with him, and he is definitely a character in the story. But by moving it in from prose into verse, the other thing I did when I revised it was I went from third person voice and past tense. So it was third, past tense, prose. to first person voice, present tense poetry. That made a huge difference as well, because suddenly we didn't have a narrator telling us this story that he already or she already knew the answer to. We were right in it with the character, and we could only know what the character knew. And so it was much more of an immediate experience of for the reader of experiencing it with the character, not knowing what was coming or how things would work out. But the other thing the poetry did was it allowed me to go inside her physical and emotional and psychological experience in ways that the prose didn't. And so I could suddenly explore her internal experience of being lonely, as well as her external experience of being hungry, or whatever the challenge might be. And much of what drew me to this story was the question of loneliness, and the question of isolation, and the question of who are we when we're not with our family and our people. And themes that have been very resonant this year in unfortunate ways. But the poetry just lent itself so much more to the deep exploration of that than the prose did. And as far as writing for a middle grade audience, when I first set out to write this story, I was inspired by a book club that I was a part of with my daughter and her friends and their mothers, where we read Island of the Blue Dolphins, and the girls were all in 5th and 6th grade at the time. And so when I was inspired to write this contemporary suburban setting, I was thinking of those girls, and I was thinking about our conversations that we'd had in that book club. And I also knew that I wanted the character to be in middle school in the beginning. She's in 7th grade in the beginning, and she's about to turn 13, and that she would span 3 years, as Jonathan said. So I wasn't clear in terms of category. Writers don't think about categories as much as librarians and booksellers, right? We're writing the story, and we're telling the story from the point of view of the characters. And then we have to figure out later how we're going to market this to the people who are going to help us get the books into the hands of the readers. But because she was in 7th grade at the beginning, and I wanted her to not be able to do the things a high school kid would be able to do, because that would make them more able and more independent, it just landed where it did in this sort of upper middle grade space. And I've taught all of these grades, and I love teaching the middle grades, and I've done a lot of class visits with 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th graders around this book. And the question of what would you do? Could you survive alone? Who are you if you're in charge of yourself and you're also relying on yourself for comfort and answers, and there's no one to make decisions for you? That's a really deep question for people who are starting to figure out who they might be separate from their parents, which is sort of that middle grade space. So this story really wanted to be a middle grade story, but the stories sort of drive it for me more than I love writing for middle grade, but I also write for other grades depending on what the story is, It's a little amorphous.
As a I was a teacher myself before I became a school librarian, and one of the trends we've seen recently in middle grade fiction is the page counts are just they're just going crazy, right? 300 and 400. And we know that not every middle grade kid can read a book like that. And so to have a struggling reader love a book, but turn it back to you and say, I love the book, but it's taking me too long. It takes me 5 minutes to read each page, and they don't feel successful. I've loved this trend that we see in verse novels in the past several decades, because there's so much white space, as you mentioned, Chris, and they can turn those pages a lot quicker, and they feel more successful as they do that. And I think that when you having fewer words on the page that they can concentrate, and like you said, when it's that balance between the internal world of the character with the narrative, the external stuff that moves the plot forward, I just think that's a wonderful combination. It's no surprise that we've kind of seen this genre kind of take root in middle grade and young adult fiction, I think, in particular.
Well, and I think there's such an important relationship between the reader and the author in a verse novel, because the author is depending on the reader to fill in all the space that isn't articulated with words, right? Jason Reynolds said last summer in a workshop, for every 10 words on the page, there are 10,000 underneath. And the author is really depending on the reader to step up and participate and collaborate in that storytelling. But at the same time, the reader is really dependent and trusting the author to give them enough so that they can get that entire story, that's the story that's there and the story that's not there. And I think graphic novels are similar. They're similarly accessible for readers who may be more reluctant or not ready for a full-length novel in prose.
I think that's really cool. I think it's part of the art form or the craft of poetry in particular, that so much is left to the reader to imagine, even though I think verse novels offer a full complement of literary elements. But at the
Absolutely.
same time, they're completely interactive. I mean, in a way that, you are invited into this situation to exist in it, to be in it, participate, because it's true. Like, I love that Reynolds quote, because there's so much left out, not on purpose, but, we're leading people into ideas so that the imagery evokes the emotion. I'm not telling you how to feel. I want you to experience this scene and then be in the scene. And that's one of the things I love about the form too. I'm really glad you talked about that.
Yeah, I think, I'd love it if you could both just talk a little bit more about your characters. I know you mentioned Maddie, and I think, when we talk about characterization, we talk about how they feel like real flesh and blood characters, right? They're not just cardboard characters. And then we talk about character development, how a character grows and changes over the course of the story. And most middle grade novels don't take place over 3 years, as you mentioned, but your challenge was the fact that you didn't have any other characters to really bounce off, with the exception of the dog, right? Who does function very much as a character. I guess the setting functions as a character in this respect a little bit too. But then you've got that wonderful friendship too, Chris, between those two distinct characters. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about how these characters, how you crafted these wonderful characters that we meet in your books.
Well, so the challenge, I had two challenges in particular with Maddie. One was the maturing from age 12 to 16, almost 16. And how her experience and her voice would change, her interior voice, as well as her perspective on the world. And then, as you mentioned, not having anyone else for her to interact with. And it's funny because when I knew I was going to introduce the dog, and as soon as I did, he comes in, I don't know, in the 20, 25 pages in or something like that. I felt this enormous sense of relief. Suddenly she had someone to interact with, even though he doesn't speak back to her. She projects all kinds of things onto him. And so suddenly there was this interplay and this dynamic. And I had this aha moment. I don't know if you remember the film Castaway with Tom Hanks, where he's on the island and he's alone for 5 years. But I realized all of a sudden why the screenwriters gave him Wilson. You remember the volleyball washes up on the shore and he personifies it and he ends up talking to it. And I thought, he had to have Wilson because he had to have somebody to interact with. And I felt this deep connection to those screenwriters because that interplay was so important. And the dog could inspire her and make her more brave, and also offer a degree of protection and comfort and all the things that animals can do for us, and dogs in particular. But one of the things that I was really interested in exploring with her progression through the story was the shift from the challenge of creating an ability to survive on a very fundamental basic level. If you're left behind in your town and there's no power and there's no running water and you have to feed and shelter yourself, and you're living in Colorado where we have weather and seasons, staying alive is a very real challenge. And so her opportunities to solve those problems for herself and figure out those things that an adult would normally be doing for her really fascinated me in the beginning. But then she figures it out, right? She learns how to live, and she survives subsequent challenges and winters and natural disasters and things. And so then the opportunity became more about the existential angst of being alone and loneliness, and the relationship of hope and expectation, and waiting for her family to come back. And what does it mean if they don't come back, and why might they not have come back, and what if they never come back, and what if there's somebody in the town next, down the road, and what if there's not, and if she leaves, what if the rescue party comes and she misses them, and all of these dilemmas that are more existential and more spiritual and psychological. Those fascinated me on a very deep level. So by letting her mature physically, she could also mature in those kinds of ways and have those crises and have to solve them herself with no one else around but the dog to help. So it provided an interesting opportunity to let her mature physically and emotionally.
Wow.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I have a love-hate relationship with wilderness survival stories. I'm a very plot-driven reader, and I love the twists and turns, but there's no drama because you always know they're they're going to survive, right? I mean,
Right.
that's just the thing. But so for me, the key is to have that really compelling character, that keeps you there and makes you just get absorbed in the story. And I think you were able to capture both the plotting as well as that character. The mix was really, really well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for Magical Imperfect, there's so many characters, and I really focus a lot on growth of these characters. I wanted it to be part of the theme, so I'm glad you asked this question, because really, there's two things I could think of right off, which is, this is a group of immigrants who came through Angel Island and settled this town, and then the story about Eitan and Malia is they're the grandkids of the people who founded the town. So, for example, you have the grandfather who was fleeing the Holocaust, came from Prague, and he brings an old box full of some mysterious stuff. And there's this constant push and pull of like the ancient world and the older Jewish ritual kind of crashing into the newer world of how things, 1989. So there's a push and pull and kind of a coming together of these things. And it causes the characters to kind of fall apart and come back together in different ways, because they're all wrestling with how things were, how things should be now, and where will they be in the future. And then, of course, there's the earthquake happening. There's tremors happening throughout the book. And, that's a normal thing in the Bay Area, but no one could have known it would have been this big. But this idea of an earthquake always looming, you never know when it's going to strike, and it affects the characters in so many ways. I mean, it's an obvious symbol, but it's like life. There's disruption, there's crashing in, there's breaking apart. And when there's an earthquake, the landscape physically changes. And these characters experience that quite a bit. So it happens within their families in the way just like that. But also for the friendship part, I think having this character of Eitan, whose mother leaves, and in '89, there weren't very obvious, clear diagnoses of depression and that kind of thing. So when she has to go to the hospital to be taken care of, and he's alone, he loses his voice, meaning he literally can't find it again. And he is selectively mute in that he doesn't really know why it's happening. Even though he's going to, he's getting therapy, he's getting help. His grandfather, he feels okay talking to his father, but not in school anymore. And you've got Malia, who is known as the creature because of her chronic skin condition. And when the two meet, it's a little bit like fireworks. They're so excited to see each other. And one of my favorite scenes in the book is where he finally meets her and she's behind the door. And it's a starting point for their relationship because he kind of cringes back a little bit when he actually does see her. And then the poetry, of course, allows for the internal pause of that moment. Mm-hmm. But the growth really comes in their relationship and coming together because she's dynamic and incredible. And so that friendship, becomes their healing.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I know we're quickly running out of time here, but I'm going to ask you just one last question. Well, first of all, what I was going to say was I wanted to ask two questions. So I'm going to give you what I think I would answer the question and then give you one to answer. So I was going to ask you about what are the themes or what would you want kids to take away from the book? And then the last question was going to be, do you have any projects on the horizon? And I realize you may not, but if you have one and you want to tell us like what the coming attractions are, that would be welcome. But, I think both of these are very timely and relevant to the modern world that we've been living in. I certainly, when I read Alone, I felt this is a book about resilience. And we're just coming out of this pandemic where so many people have been socially isolated and physically distant that it has this wonderful resonance with what we're going through right now, even though it's kind of set in the future. And then, your book, Chris, I really felt like this is a book that is about identity and it's about intersectional identity. It's not just about race and ethnicity, but it's also about, like you said, mental health and ability and disability and these complex pieces of ourselves. So, obviously, I think that, with a lot of the social justice movement that's been happening and the push for equity and a more diverse inclusion and representation, I felt both of these were very powerfully relevant to the time that we're living in right now. So I'll give you just a few seconds to respond to anything that I said, and then if you have something you want to say about what we can look forward to, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And I wish that our books were not coming out during a pandemic, because I wish that there were not a pandemic happening. But if they can in some way offer some way to think about the pandemic or process any of the experiences that we've had, then I'm glad that that can be an opportunity for them. I have some things in the works that I'm not allowed to talk about yet, but that I hope to be able to share soon. So I will just leave that out, hanging out there, and hopefully I'll be able to give you more information shortly.
Thank you. Final words, Chris?
Yeah, same thing. Things I can't talk about, but excited to share eventually. And also this also came out, which is a YA book, an incredible collection. I have a story in here called Food is Love, reminiscent of all of me. But yeah, I mean, for me, I feel like in this time, I love what you said, Jonathan, about those themes. And this really is a time where we need to treasure each other. And that's not easy for us being like everyone. But I want, I'm hoping people, after they read, this book and Megan's book, they start to treasure each other more. They find empathy and kindness as a pathway versus dominating or trying to be stronger than someone else. But real strength comes through, and like healing can come through friendship and working through things. It doesn't have to be fast or easy. It can be story, so.
Great. I want to thank you both very much. Megan Freeman, author of Alone, Chris Barron, author of The Magical Imperfect. Please, please, please buy these books from your nearest independent bookshop, or you can simply purchase it from the website that is flashing on the screen. I am Jonathan Hunt, Coordinator of Library Media Services at San Diego County Office of Education. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.